Okay, my name is Anele Siswana. I am a clinical psychologist and divine healer within the African context, which I do a lot of things relating to prayer, divine healing, divine intervention. I am a preacher in the Methodist Church. I study theology, and I identify as queer. At the same time, I work as a lecturer. So I have different or multiple identities that describe the person that I am as a preacher, as a lecturer, as a queer man, as a brother, as a son, and in different ways. So this is me as Anele.
Wow. Wow.
How I do this or work within this framework is I do not neglect the self. That is, I consider myself to be the tool that does the work of a therapist. As you would know, probably in the context of Eurocentric way of doing psychology, you're always told to be removed from the experience of doing therapy because it's about the client, it's about doing the service. However, for me, in my practice and how I understand this within the framework of African psychology, I, as a psychologist, I'm the one who is a tool. And I being a tool, meaning that I bring in my full self, my multiple identities, my way of being. However, I'm mindful of how those identities may influence the process, and I'm able to reflect on how those things work. For example, in my therapeutic space, where I, from time to time, I have clients that some would basically come to me because they have heard that I'm a psychologist that probably identifies as a Christian. I'm a psychologist that identifies as a divine healer, as a queer man in that. So how those are influential and important in the process is that it benefits the need of a client. And so how I then bring the diviner in the process, I may not necessarily bring that as something that is obvious. So, but I would bring it in a way that benefits the client. If, for instance, I recently had a client, on one of these clients, she presented with depression. And for the longest time, we've been working together for almost 2 years. And interestingly, on that day, I had my shawl, that is symbolic of my ancestors. And that day, it was a moment where I didn't even plan. I wasn't conscious of it. I had driven out of my house and something said, go back. And so I didn't resist. I went to take my shawl. I put it on my shoulders, went to do my lectures. I did that, and then after that I had to go to my private practice. However, I was mindful of the space now. So I took it off and I put it on at the back of my chair. However, when the client walked in the room, she noticed the shawl. And she said that was her moment of a breakthrough. Because for the longest time, she did not understand what was she going through. However, there was a level of a link that actually said, probably it's the right time to bring in that which I have been struggling with. So I laughed. She said, you look like a Caucasian psychologist. Like one of these sophisticated guys. You work in Sentin, you're quite young. I would not have thought or imagined you in that way. And that's when I thought about maybe this is what looks like doing African psychology or African therapy, if you can call it. How it was beneficial for her, she says, she wanted a therapist that will make her understand of what she was going through. And interestingly, and again, at that time, I was also in my own process of discernment. So it was a moment for us of rediscovering something that we are both trying to make sense of and to understand what it means. And so eventually, in that moment, we then explored what this depression felt like. And her presentation, she would say, it feels like I've got a heavy burden. I've got something on my shoulders. And this happens especially when I'm around people or in a space that is crowded. And so I said, do you think it's depression or it's abogogo, your ancestors communicating some energies that you need to be mindful of? She says, I never thought of it in that way. And then we took it further to the point I said, okay, now that you fully acknowledge your calling, she would come with dreams. I said to her, maybe it's not the right space for me to engage at that level. However, I can recommend Inyangi, and someone who is working both from his Tunya perspective, the divine side, and the ancestral side, and perhaps we can unfold it further so that we don't clash. So I sent it to the Sangoma, she went, and she said that was an aha moment for her, because she could realize the physical symptomology that she had and the symptoms she presented psychologically were an indication of dis-ease that required her to listen and discern of what was going on. But because she could not understand that process and that world, she could not relate with the world. And so I said, okay, when you are done with that, then we can come back and work and tick around how things were. She struggled to find work, relationship-wise and all of that. And then one of the things she needed to do was to go to home to speak to one of her great-grandfathers who is supposedly the ancestor. Had it been the traditional psychologist in me, I would not have entertained those processes. But I believe as part of holistic healing, you have multiple ways of doing things and undoing certain things. And for me, one of the multiple factors was, if we're in a medical team in a psychiatric hospital, we would have a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, and all of that. However, the context of this experience did not need a psychiatrist. It needed someone who's more above in that world. So she went and did all her rituals. She says, it was not even a week. I got a job. An ex that I had 5 years ago in the state came back and actually said, I want to marry you. And women are like, okay, what is going on here? And then I began to realize that there's an element of supernaturality that informs the space. I, being a therapist, as a tool, there may be some messages sent to me to interpret the context, but being mindful of the fact that I'm a psychologist. However, in that space, for me, therapeutically, I call myself a healer. A healer involved in many different aspects, because you heal the mind, you heal the body, you heal the spirit, but mine, somehow, the universe speaks that I speak to the soul, and that speaks to many other different things. In terms of my research around queer studies, I'm interested more on African men, particularly because I'm Xhosa, on Xhosa men, on the formation of becoming a Xhosa man. And so that work for me is science. And what is science for me, it may not be recorded, but I have a conviction that says African people have always had science. How the academic world interprets science is different from how lay African people would deem it. So people have always had ways of doing things and undoing things. When I sit with my grandmother, she tells me stories. It could be a story that relates a particular experience. But the fact that it's not recorded does not mean it's a science of oral tradition of transferring information and knowledge to the next generation. So as someone who does work in initiation practice, I pull on concepts of psychology, like resilience, when a young boy or just a new man has just been initiated. The pain is a physical pain, but is translated as a tool of how you'll be able to navigate painful experiences. So the wound is symbolic of the process that will allow you and equip you to be able to cope. The socialization of what happens, of shaping this mentality of becoming responsible, of becoming a provider, of becoming a man that sees himself beyond than just it being a personal gain or being given male privilege, but creating a level of consciousness to this young new man who needs to find a way of navigating his space in the world. So we can contextualize different contexts that speak to ways of doing African psychology. African psychology, in my understanding, speaks to how African people do things, understand things, and know what they know, and how they know what they know. So what I mean by African people telling stories from their own perspective is that psychology has always existed. It's about the mind, it's about understanding humanity. It's about understanding the psyche of a person. And so personhood speaks to African psychology for me. And so these kind of ways of doing on how to become, talking about identity within a specific kind of cultural oriented specific thing. So what I'm trying to say is African psychology for me is doing psychology with African people, for the African people, and trying to make sense of what this means for them and with others. And from a context of African psychology, you don't do psychology for the self. You do psychology with the self within the collective sense of what it means to be. So African psychology could be anything and mean anything to any African person on ways of how to understand the mind, how we think, and how we do certain things as practices and as a matter of tradition.